Thabo had known Molefe since childhood. They had been inseparable, their bond forged through shared memories of growing up in a small village in Botswana. Molefe was everything Thabo admired: confident, kind-hearted, and effortlessly charming. Thabo admired him from a distance, hiding his growing feelings behind a mask of tradition and family values, none of which aligned with the growing emotions Thabo harbored. At school, they were known as the dynamic duo, always together, always laughing. But underneath that laughter, Thabo wrestled with a secret that felt heavier with each passing day. As they spent more time together, his feelings deepened, yet he never dared to say a word. Thabo feared the consequences. If anyone found out, it would tear apart the life he had so carefully built. Every glance and every shared moment with Molefe was a bittersweet reminder of what could never be. He could never let his feelings slip. Thabo's home was a place of strict rules. His father was a respected elder in their community, and his mother was a dutiful wife who embodied all the traditional values. Family was everything, and the expectations placed on him were heavy. To disappoint them was unthinkable. His father often spoke of the importance of securing a future with a woman and continuing the family name. Thabo knew the expectations and, though he never spoke of it, feared the repercussions of not fulfilling them. When he and Molefe spent time together, they often went to a secluded spot near the river, an oasis where they could be themselves without fear of prying eyes. Here, Thabo felt free to laugh, to relax, and for a moment, forget the weight of his secret. It was in these moments that Thabo's love for Molefe grew stronger, more undeniable. But with every stolen glance and every brush of their hands, Thabo's heart grew heavier. He knew deep down that this feeling was dangerous, not just for him, but for everything he held dear. There was no world where his parents would accept his truth. As the years passed, Thabo found himself trapped in a growing storm of emotions. Molefe seemed oblivious to the internal struggle that churned inside Thabo. They talked about everything: school, friends, dreams for the future. But there was always a wall Thabo built between them. Molefe never suspected a thing, which only made Thabo's feelings more painful. Molefe was the kind of person who would never judge anyone, but Thabo knew the world they lived in would never be as understanding. Thabo's fear of being discovered was all-consuming. He couldn't even bring himself to talk to Molefe about his feelings. Whenever their conversations veered too close to personal topics, Thabo would quickly change the subject, deflecting in a way that Molefe never seemed to notice. The more time they spent together, the harder it became for Thabo to keep his secret hidden, and the fear of rejection from his family and from society continued to weigh on his heart, leaving him to live a life of quiet denial. It was one quiet evening when Thabo's world began to unravel. He and Molefe had stayed up late, talking and laughing as always, but this time, something shifted. Thabo found himself staring at Molefe with a vulnerability he had never allowed himself to show before. Molefe, sensing the shift in the air, looked at him with curiosity, his eyes searching Thabo's face as if trying to read something hidden beneath the surface. "Are you okay, Thabo?" Molefe asked, his voice soft. Thabo opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the tension thick and palpable. Thabo's heart raced as he fought the urge to confess everything. He wanted to tell Molefe the truth, but fear kept him rooted in place. "You've been distant lately," Molefe continued, his brow furrowing slightly. Thabo smiled weakly, telling himself it was just the weight of schoolwork. But in his heart, he knew it was something more. The truth was too dangerous to voice aloud. He had too many stories to take one man's life, just tragic poking holes in them. Weeks passed, and the silence between Thabo and Molefe grew, though Molefe seemed unaware of the change. But for Thabo, each moment felt like a ticking clock, each second an eternity of unspoken words. His love for Molefe was no longer something he could ignore or bury. It was out there, smoldering inside him, and the longer he waited, the more unbearable it became. One night, after a particularly long conversation, Thabo finally broke. They were sitting under the stars, the cool breeze rustling the trees around them. Thabo, feeling the weight of his own heartache, turned to Molefe and said the words he had been holding in for so long. "I think I might love you, Molefe," he whispered. Molefe froze. The silence stretched out between them, thick and suffocating. Molefe's face showed confusion, then concern, and finally pity. Thabo's heart shattered. He quickly looked away, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Molefe gently placed a hand on Thabo's shoulder, but it felt like the final blow. I didn't know, Thabo," Molefe murmured softly, his voice filled with empathy. "But I'm not sure how I feel about that." Thabo nodded, the truth sinking deep into his bones. He had known this would happen. The weight of the world seemed to crash down on him as he realized his secret had irrevocably changed everything. The following days were filled with tension. Molefe began to distance himself, unsure of how to handle the confession. Thabo's heart broke with every awkward silence, with every step Molefe took away from him. The conversations that had once been easy and natural now felt strained and uncomfortable. Thabo's fear had always been that his feelings for Molefe would ruin their friendship, but he never expected it to spiral so quickly. As much as Molefe tried to be understanding, there was an undeniable discomfort in the air whenever they spoke. Thabo could see the pity in Molefe's eyes, the way he struggled to find the right words. Molefe wasn't angry, but the distance that had crept into their friendship felt like a slow, painful death. Thabo realized that the truth had cost him more than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just his relationship with Molefe that was at stake. It was his entire world. Thabo couldn't escape the truth any longer. He had known for years that his feelings for Molefe were not something he could ignore, but confessing them had opened a door he wasn't ready to walk through. The pressure of his family's expectations now loomed even larger. If they found out about his feelings, his love for another man, he would be condemned. They would disown him. He had seen it happen to others in his village, the whispers, the stares, the judgment. Thabo wasn't ready to face that yet. As he sat alone in his room that evening, his phone rang. It was his mother. Her voice, warm and familiar, was a stark contrast to the coldness that had settled in his chest. "Thabo, are you coming home for dinner?" she asked. He hesitated. The weight of the conversation he had just had with Molefe was still fresh in his mind. "I'll be there soon, Mom," he replied, trying to mask the unease in his voice. Little did Thabo know, his world was about to change forever. Thabo had hoped the dinner would be a distraction from the heavy feelings weighing on him, but when he arrived home, he immediately noticed something was off. His parents, though polite, exchanged glances over their food. The silence at the table was almost suffocating. His mother kept glancing at him with concern, and his father's eyes, usually warm and commanding, were cold tonight. Thabo's stomach churned as he wondered what was wrong. "Thabo," his father began, his voice firm, "we need to talk." Thabo's heart skipped a beat. He had always dreaded these words, the inevitable moment when the truth would finally come to light. His father's expression was unreadable, but Thabo could see the anger and disappointment just beneath the surface. The reality of his secret, of what he had become, was about to unfold in the worst possible way. His father's voice was low and menacing. "I heard about you and Molefe," he said, his eyes narrowing. Thabo's heart froze. "Is it true?" Thabo swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His father didn't wait for him to answer. "You're bringing shame on this family. You are not the son I raised." Thabo's world tilted on its axis. He had feared this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the sting of his father's words. The rejection, the disgust, the deep disappointment that dripped from every syllable. They were more than he could bear. The rest of the meal passed in agonizing silence. But Thabo could no longer focus on the food in front of him. All he could think about was how his life had just unraveled before his eyes. After dinner, Thabo retreated to his room, his mind racing with disbelief. The weight of his father's words crushed him. He had always known that revealing his feelings would cost him something, but he never imagined it would cost him everything. He could hear his parents talking in the other room, their voices rising in heated discussion. His mother's voice trembled with concern, but his father's anger drowned out everything else. Thabo lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a stranger in his own home. He had lost Molefe's friendship, and now it seemed he had lost his family too. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but there was nothing left to say. The pain of rejection ran so deep that he couldn't even cry. All he could do was lie there in the silence of his own heartache, unsure of what his future would hold. The days after the dinner were marked by an unsettling silence. Thabo no longer found the comfort he once sought in his home. His father avoided looking at him, while his mother spoke only when necessary, her eyes filled with sadness. The household that had once felt warm and inviting now seemed like a prison. Every corner of the house felt suffocating, and the weight of his father's words loomed over him. Thabo spent more time alone in his room, away from the ever-present tension downstairs. He knew his parents were hoping this would pass, that he would simply change and fall back into the mold they had set for him. But deep down, Thabo knew he could never go back. He had already crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. His life as he knew it had been altered forever. Molefe's absence weighed heavily on Thabo, the boy who had been his best friend. The one person who had understood him in ways no one else could was now distant and unreachable. Thabo missed him desperately, but every attempt to reach out only led to more awkwardness. Molefe's initial shock had given way to a kind of cautious avoidance. The conversations they used to share easily were now reduced to brief exchanges, laced with discomfort. Thabo's heart ached at the thought of losing Molefe, the person he had loved for so long. But he couldn't blame him. Molefe was only trying to process something he had never expected. And maybe, Thabo thought bitterly, he had known Molefe wasn't ready for this kind of love. But that didn't make the hurt any easier to bear. Each text that went unanswered, each passing day without Molefe's smile, felt like a further rejection. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. The small village Thabo grew up in was a tight-knit community where news spread faster than wildfire. By the time Thabo stepped out of his house the next morning, he could feel the eyes of the villagers upon him. People who had once smiled at him with warmth now avoided his gaze. The mothers with their children averted their eyes, and the men who had once shared a drink with his father now looked at him with barely concealed disdain. Thabo could feel the weight of their judgment on his shoulders, like 1,000 invisible hands pushing him down. His father's disapproval had been difficult, but this was something else entirely. This was the judgment of a community that had no room for someone like him. The quiet rejection in every passing glance stung, more than anything his father could have said. One afternoon, his mother came into his room with a somber expression. She had always been the quiet, gentle one in the family, but there was an unmistakable weight to her presence now. "Thabo, your father wants to speak with you," she said, her voice tight with restrained emotion. Thabo's heart began to race. He had not expected to face his father after their heated argument. For days they had avoided each other, but now it seemed unavoidable. With a deep breath, Thabo stood and followed his mother downstairs. His father sat at the head of the table, his face stern and unreadable. "Thabo," his father began, his voice low but commanding, This is not who he raised you to be." The words hit Thabo like a slap. He had hoped for some understanding, some sign that his father might still love him despite everything, but there was none. "You have brought shame upon this family, and you have dishonored your mother and me." Thabo looked at his father, his chest tight. "I didn't ask for this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "This is who I am." His father stood up, his eyes filled with frustration. "No, Thabo, this is not who you are. You are confused, and I can help you get back on the right path." The refusal to accept his truth was like a knife in Thabo's heart. He realized in that moment that nothing he said would change his father's mind. The man who had once been his role model now seemed like a stranger. That night, as Thabo lay in bed, he could hear his parents arguing in the next room. His father's voice rose in anger, but his mother's softer tone was tinged with a kind of sorrow that Thabo had never heard before. He knew she was struggling, torn between her love for him and the expectations of the community and her husband. It was clear that his mother, for all her love, had no power to change the situation. The door to reconciliation seemed to be closing, and Thabo knew he was the one holding the key. Thabo's mind raced as he thought of Molefe and how everything had fallen apart. His heart ached for the boy he loved, the boy who had never asked for the weight of Thabo's love. The world he had known seemed to be slipping through his fingers. The walls of his home felt smaller, tighter, and there was no escape. For the first time in his life, Thabo felt completely and utterly alone. A week passed without a word from his parents. Thabo spent his days in a haze, drifting between thoughts of Molefe, his family, and the future. The longer he stayed in the house, the more suffocating it felt. He could hear the whispers through the walls, his father's voice, his mother's quiet sobs. They were all speaking about him as if he were something broken that needed to be fixed. One evening, as the sun began to set, Thabo made the decision. It wasn't just about Molefe anymore. It was about his own survival. He couldn't stay in this house, trapped between the love he had for his family and the truth of who he was. He gathered a few belongings and quietly packed a bag, careful not to make any noise. His mother knocked on his door just as he was about to leave. Thabo froze, his hand on the door handle. "Thabo, where are you going?" she asked softly. Her voice was full of uncertainty, of 1,000 unspoken words. "I'm leaving," he replied, his voice steady, though his heart was breaking. "I can't stay here anymore." No sparkle. His mother didn't say anything for a moment, but Thabo could hear her trying to hold back tears. "Don't go, my son," she whispered. "Please, don't go." But Thabo opened the door and stepped out. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't live a lie anymore." The road ahead was uncertain. Thabo had no idea where he was going or what he would do. He had always lived under the protection of his family's expectations. But now he was alone, facing a world that had shown him only rejection. Yet, for the first time in weeks, Thabo felt a spark of something that resembled hope. The night was cool as he walked into the unknown, the darkness both comforting and terrifying. The path ahead was unclear, but he knew one thing for certain. He could no longer live a life dictated by fear. He had to find himself, even if it meant leaving everything behind. His heart ached with the weight of his decision, but he knew there was no turning back. As Thabo walked through the streets of the nearby town, he had no idea where to go. But something inside him had shifted. The constant weight of his family's expectations no longer controlled him. He had spent his entire life trying to fit into a mold that wasn't made for him. Now he was free to explore who he really was, beyond the labels and constraints imposed by those around him. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the rawness of the world around him. It was no more pretending, no more hiding. It was just him, alone and vulnerable. But for the first time, there was a sense of liberation that coursed through his veins. Thabo's journey was only beginning. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also understood that it was his journey to take. The world was large, filled with both danger and possibility, but Thabo was no longer afraid to face it. As he walked through the streets, unsure of what would happen next, he realized something profound. He was finally living for himself.